looking compliant and typical in a school setting or even with grandparents or a therapist, and then coming home to that perceived safety and immediately taking off the mask and seeming totally different.
Some kids struggle with their emotions and have big reactions to situations that appear from the outside to be relatively small situations. For a subgroup of autistic people, this can be associated with pathological demand avoidance. How can parents and educators understand and support kids whose immediate response to even small demands is fight, flight, or freeze? And how can we help co-regulate their emotions? Today's guest, Dr. Casey Ehrlich of At Peace Parents, is going to share with us how she supports her PDA child and what she's learned about peaceful parenting. That's straight ahead on episode 169. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
So I just want to remind you of a new opportunity that we have available through Neurodiversity University. The SPACE program, Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions, is an opportunity that is for kids, but through parents. We consult and coach parents to develop habits and methods that they can in turn use to help their kids deal with various types of anxiety, OCD, and other issues. This whole program is about helping parents change their behavior and approach to how they're supporting their kids. There are a few different levels available, and all of it's done online. We have one-on-one consultations with a SPACE-trained advisor, and group sessions with other parents are also available. To learn more, click the link in the show notes or on the podcast's episode page, or you can go to neurodiversity.university. Dr. Casey Ehrlich is up next.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
You know, if you saw a picture of autistic people on a charity website, it would always be children. And in fact, it would always be sort of sad-looking children, like looking at the world through a foggy piece of glass or something like that, or, you know, with puzzle pieces missing, etc. Now we understand that that diversity is actually a strength, even in a company. So that the Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago ran a front page article. You know, Harvard Business Review is like, when big capitalism gets serious about something, it goes to the Harvard Business Review. And the Harvard Business Review talked about how hiring people with conditions like autism, dyslexia, and ADHD is not just being nice, but it actually helps build company value for stockholders.
That's episode 119. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Today, I am excited to talk to Casey Ehrlich. Casey is the founder of At Peace Parents and the host of the At Peace Parents podcast. She is also the parent of an autistic child. So thank you so much for joining us today, Casey.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me.
So our episodes related to pervasive or pathological demand avoidance are always some that our audience is just really extremely interested in hearing. But I'm sure that a lot of our listeners may also be new to the idea. So I'm curious, how would you describe PDA to someone who hasn't heard of it before?
So I think if I was just meeting someone on the street, I would say my son has a nervous system disability, and his brain is wired at a baseline as if he had experienced severe trauma. However, if I was on a podcast, like I am, or interacting with someone who wanted to go deeper, I would say my son's brain, every time he perceives on a subconscious and automatic level that he has lost autonomy or freedom and choice or equality to me, his surroundings, teachers, societal expectations, his survival part of his brain tells the rest of his body he's going to die. And so he has all the physiological sensations of panic. His heart races, his chest hurts, he starts to feel like there's a lion in front of him. He has a fight or a flight response, which can look like really challenging behavior or running away, climbing on the backs of couches, on top of a car, for example. He used to do that when we were trying to transition to school in the mornings. So that's not my academic answer, but if I wasn't teaching, that's how I would describe it.
How does your academic answer differ?
Yeah, so my academic answer is more along the lines of how do we introduce precise language to distinguish this neurotype from other neurotypes? And basically the definition that I use, it's a little different than the PDA Society, which is an anxiety-driven need for control. The definition I use is a survival drive for autonomy that consistently overrides other survival instincts, such as hunger, eating, toileting, hygiene, either in the moment or in accumulation over time. And that's what makes it a disability.
PDA typically is described as under the autism umbrella. What are your thoughts about what makes the PDA profile different?
From an academic standpoint, and I can give you examples if you like, from an academic standpoint, how I believe that PDA differs from like a non-PDA autism is that it's like the first filter, right? Like that survival drive for autonomy is going to override other things like those basic instincts, but even things like an autistic need for routine, for example, or certainty. And I think like I use a 5-characteristic framework to help parents and therapists identify whether or not a child is PDA. And that's the survival drive for autonomy. The observable behavior is what Christy Forbes calls leveling or compensation behavior. I use the term equalizing, and that's when they have perceived in their body and brain that lack of safety because of the perception of the loss of autonomy or equality. And they're trying to get back to a place of safety, and it's almost reflexive behavior, but it can look very controlling. It can look like them correcting you or destroying your things. You know, I'm happy to give more examples, but that's like the second characteristic, that equalizing behavior that you don't see as much in non-PDA autistic children. Although, you know, it's all based on root causes, so there can be overlap. You know, it could be sensory driven why a child is engaging in what looks like equalizing behavior. So you can't always decipher. The third is high masking, which is like appearing as two different versions. Usually the place that the child perceives they're not safe on a subconscious level, they'll internalize that threat response and go more freeze fawn. And that means just like looking compliant and typical in a school setting or even with grandparents or a therapist, and then coming home to that perceived safety and immediately taking off the mask and seeming totally different. Mm-hmm. And that can be extremely confusing and difficult for parents, especially because people can't believe sort of the difference between the two contexts. The fourth aspect is the constant need for undivided attention and co-regulation, which I also believe is distinct from what at least the parent and therapeutic experience is of non-PDA autistic children. I am not speaking from like my own neurotype, so we'd have to listen to the voices of those individuals. But when parents that I work with go to like support groups, they feel very much like outsiders because their children are like, quote, they have lower social communication support needs as PDAers, meaning they appear social, outgoing, but at the same time, they can't play independently, and their support needs are really around basic needs and accessing things like leaving the house and school versus social communication supports and like going through transitions. And then the fifth characteristic is really just the fluctuating nature. It's experienced from the outside as like constantly walking on eggshells, meaning you never know what's going to set off the child. So whereas you might have a non-PDA autistic child who like, you know, every time there's a particular sound or a particular person, it sets them off, right? Whereas with a PDA child, the same exact sound maybe totally fine 7 days in a row, but as stress accumulates in the nervous system, the 8th time is going to put them into a total panic attack. You know, it's not one or the other, like PDA children are autistic, although I ran a very interesting poll in my Instagram today because I wanted to answer this question more in depth.
Yeah.
So people often ask me, is PDA always autism? I actually don't know. However, when I've listened to PDA autistic voices, their perspective has been, meaning advocates, has been, yes, like it's one and the same. Like you can't be PDA without autism. But I have a lot of followers who identify as PDA themselves, parents of PDA children. And I did a poll today of like, if you identify as an internalized PDA, or do you also identify as autistic? And 61% said yes. There were 91 people that responded, but 39% said they either didn't know or know.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, there's some variability here in terms of how people identify.
Well, and I think the research is so emergent too about what all of that really means and how it manifests, it seems. In my counseling practice, the PDAers who I've worked with definitely meet the criteria also for that autism diagnosis. But that demand avoidance, I feel like, especially with just within the neurodivergent experience, and I think this kind of goes into another thing that I wanted to ask about, there's so much internalized trauma and stress and different things that I think that the demand avoidance in and of itself is very pervasive.
Yes.
Whether or not it's related to PDA or autism specifically.
Absolutely. I think that's when we have to get to the root cause. And what I say often is like, it's an empirical question. So like often parents or therapists start with like, okay, maybe it's sensory avoidance. So like, let's experiment with, you know, getting more comfortable shoes or compression shirts or, you know, headphones or whatever our hypothesis is for like, they're avoiding something because of a sensory pain. And often like, the PDA or a nervous system response to perceived loss of autonomy and equality is sort of the last hypothesis that parents or practitioners come to. But once they start accommodating or supporting that need, then they see the demand avoidance go away. Not go away, I should say. They see some of the more intense fight-flight behaviors or freeze behaviors and the dramatic impact on basic needs decrease.
Once they start to feel a little bit more in control of their surroundings, they feel safer. And so then they can persist with some of those tasks that maybe before they were completely avoiding.
Yeah, sometimes, like depending where they are in their journey.
Well, and let's talk a little bit more just about trauma and burnout and how all of those things kind of wrap up into this experience as well.
This is such a complex question, and I love it for that reason. I think the majority of PDA children have also experienced trauma, not because they were neglected or abused or in, a catastrophic weather event, but really because from the outside looking in, they look fairly typical often, and they're being responded to with behavioral approaches and traditional parenting. And so internally, every time they're presented with that response, even if they don't understand why, having this nervous system that's like, you're in danger. And so that's repeated over and over again. And it is inescapable for a child, right? And they probably ascribe meaning to it. Often they get negative feedback socially from their parents, from therapists. And so it becomes traumatic. And there are really 3 life scenarios that I see causing that trauma. And one is traditional parenting, one is school, and the other is behavioral modification therapies. And this is why there's like no one right answer of like, should a PDA kid go to school or not? Some have deep trauma around school, but didn't have trauma with their parents because their parents intuited, okay, well, let's be flexible. We don't need to do consequences. We don't necessarily know about PDA, but we're going to adapt because we're intuitive parents. And then they go to school and they just over and over again in their amygdala are perceiving danger. And they often don't even understand why. So yeah, it's very deeply intertwined. And so the good news is a lot of trauma-informed strategies are supportive of PDA kids.
Right.
But we do have to add on that nuance of, like, sometimes they actually need to feel above a situation or above another person. And sometimes we don't want to push towards resilience too quickly in the journey of like establishing trust or getting them out of burnout.
Yeah.
So my son, I'll just name like our experience.
Yeah.
I and my husband, but mostly me, were perpetrators of the trauma because I was very much a like traditional parent. And, you know, I never laid hands on him or anything, but I was like, no, you have to eat before you get dessert. You have to clean up your toys. I'm going to sit here with you and you can't do anything else until you do that. And it was like in those moments, I thought I was applying natural consequences or consequences as was recommended by the pediatrician, but inside his body, he was experiencing panic, but it looked like defiance to me. And so for him, you know, he was at a pretty laissez-faire daycare with animals and stuff and other kids, and he's extroverted. And so for him, the trauma was at home, not at school. So he's never had like de facto school refusal. I mean, he did go through a period of that with public school just because it's public school and he's PDA.
Yeah.
And so the more I responded with, you know, 1, 2, 3 magic, positive discipline, all that stuff, the more I started to see it move beyond his behaviors and into like pure fight or flight, almost like it was almost like he would turn into a feral animal. And I don't say that disparagingly. It was like an animal that was scared and it impacted his ability to eat, move, like his legs. So he would say, my legs don't work. We would have to like pull him in a wagon or carry him everywhere for actually like 2 years. And we would have to bounce his body on the trampoline for like hours each day because he couldn't bounce himself. That's an example of like, he needed the sensory input, but like the nervous system disability was overriding that.
Yeah.
So he stopped eating, stopped largely talking, stopped really making eye contact, and stopped like walking and moving. And he stopped leaving the house. So like concentric circles moving out beyond the house that like 2 years ago, he could leave the house for like an hour without a panic attack. And now we're sort of back at 4 years later, a baseline where from the outside, he appears very typical sometimes, but we're like always monitoring nervous system regulation, like insulin levels of a diabetic child. So that was his autistic burnout. And when parents are going through this, we really have to err on like providing as much autonomy and equality and lowered demands and accommodations as humanly possible. And it sometimes requires big lifestyle changes for the parents. Like we left Washington, D.C. because I left my career and we're in a trauma cave for a couple of years there.
It's really scary, I think, for parents to go through that because it's just a risk. You just don't, it's scary when you're kind of going in that uncharted territory, which I think for a lot of parents of PDA kids, it is.
And that's why I encourage parents to like get into the data collection mindset.
Yes.
You know, like really tuning into their nervous system responses, like nonverbal cues of how they're reacting and tracking basic needs, because there's not going to be a lot of like verbal communication about like the internal state of how the child is feeling. So it's a real mindset shift for parents.
Just from a therapeutic perspective as a clinician, the number of people who are referred to our office from pediatricians, and the pediatricians are telling them, find somebody who does cognitive behavioral therapy, or, oh, you have an autism diagnosis, find ABA.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do we overcome this? Like, how do we change this and recognize that it's not one size fits all? School isn't one size fits all. Therapy isn't one size fits all. And you were talking about those base levels, like what's the foundational piece? whatever professional you've got to figure out that piece first in order to build on it. Because without, it's kind of like a house of cards. It's just going to fall at the easiest little, jostling.
For me, like when in doubt, go to connection always.
Yeah.
Focusing on the trust and the relationship. And there is that nuance of like, in order to establish a safe relationship, you may have to provide a lot more autonomy than you're comfortable with as a therapist or as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
For me, with any parent I work with, that's like the primary thing to focus on first, is like trust and connection.
So talk a little bit more about that. What does that mean for you, and how can they accomplish that? Like, what are some of the ways that you suggest that they can focus on that connection?
I teach like the 10 most effective accommodations.
Yeah.
If we can think through the lens of root cause, then parents and therapists can get creative with their zones of genius, right? Which is like, if we know that every time this child perceives threat when they don't have autonomy, which means like choice and freedom, then how can we really offer that in the home and in a therapeutic setting? And that can be really uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So like, let's take eating, which is a huge source of trauma and resistance for my son, and what I call his stickiest basic need, because often there's one basic need that's primarily affected, which can be confusing for like pediatricians, because it's like you have one kid who's, more internalized. So they look highly anxious and they go into freeze, but they've stopped sleeping. They're on a non-24-hour sleep cycle and they say their legs can't work. And then you have another child like my son who's sleeping fine, but largely stopped eating and totally explosive and seems violent. You're not going to equate those two children from the outside unless you understand that nervous system mechanism and neuroception.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can understand at the root the autonomy, we can do things like around eating. Like my son, I just had to let go of everything of like, he can eat when he wants. I deliver him food, which is lowering the demand of his body having to go get it. He eats what his body can tolerate, whether that's sensory, an evocative cue from trauma, or the autonomy lens. All of it is at play with avoiding eating.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have to eat at the table. He doesn't have to clean up after himself. So he has the freedom to choose. And that's paired with the accommodation of me supporting his nervous system and doing it for him, which is how I think of lowering demands. And that's the other side of the coin that really confuses people. Well, if we're giving them all this independence and autonomy, why won't they do anything?
Yeah.
But it's because they don't perceive nervous system safety and they're in nervous system burnout. And that's the same thing I mentioned with like jumping on the trampoline. My son wanted to jump on the trampoline for hours, but I had to do it for him.
Meaning that you were standing on the trampoline, like jumping?
Bouncing his body for like hours.
Yeah.
He wouldn't bounce his own body, his legs, or swinging. Like he wouldn't, even though he could physically do it, he wouldn't swing his own body.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had to do it for him for an hour at a time. So there is a caregiving part, or like lowering the demand,
right,
and providing autonomy, which can seem paradoxical, but they're both related to that nervous system disability. So in a home setting, it would be like thinking about what actually is worth the cost of your child's nervous system activation. And so like, does it really matter for their like health and well-being if they say please and thank you or hug the grandparent?
Right.
So that's autonomy and lowering demands. And then equality is allowing them to feel equal to or above you. And I don't necessarily recommend this for siblings because I work with family systems. So like the PDA child has a nervous system disability and therefore there will be more focus on that child because that's what happens in a family with a child with a disability. However, it's not the sibling's responsibility to accommodate, it's the parents. So what that means is like, and this is pretty controversial. I know that because I get lots of comments on my TikToks and like Instagram, which is like, I deliberately put myself below my son, whether it's physically on the floor to de-escalate or preempt that perception of inequality. Or if he yells at me and I take it as like, oh, that's data that he's activated. Mm-hmm. Let's say he wants pancakes. He's like, pancakes, which can come off as very rude. He's on the couch. I'm delivering it to him. I'm like, sure, honey, I'll go grab it. And I go in the kitchen and I'm like, I see my husband. So we start chatting and he's like, where are my pancakes? And he yells at me. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, honey, they're coming. Right. And then I go in and he's like, these aren't hot. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll heat them up again. Right. So I'm like de-escalating that threat response as caregiving, which I know for many of you listeners out there are going to be like, you're just teaching him bad behavior and you're going to make him an abusive adult, which my counter argument is in those moments, he is responding that way. He is not in his thinking brain. That's data that his nervous system is activated. I can step into my agency and make a choice. This is my choice to accommodate. And the more I do that, the more neural pathways we create in regulation and trust. And then once he's back in his thinking brain, can learn and I can model compassion. And I know not everyone agrees with that, but that's my approach to supporting my son and supporting parents, support their PDA children. And it is transformational. It's just, you got to get past the like fear thoughts of, if I do this now, they'll never learn X or they'll turn out to be a bad person.
I can understand why that gets a lot of pushback from people.
Totally.
And I think it's like really hard to envision what that even can look like sometimes for some families. But I want to ask you specifically, because a lot of our audience are educators.
Yeah.
What does that look like in a classroom setting? Like, how do you envision that in the schools that maybe teachers could kind of think about how they could apply it if they've got a kiddo who's dealing with us?
Sure. Okay. So I think one thing to understand is that I'm speaking from a place of the primary accommodation for my son.
Right.
Right. And that is the role for parents. Like my nervous system and now my husband's are the primary accommodation for his disability. That's not necessarily going to be the case with a teacher because you can't be one-on-one necessarily with nervous system to nervous system. Right. And
right.
I think the lesson we can learn from these two examples of like autonomy, like, you know, how the child does the work, right? Like instead of, oh, you have to start in this order of like step A, B, C, D, maybe they start at D and like let it go or lower the demand of homework or allow them to take breaks or allow them to opt out, allow them to integrate choice within the constraints of a classroom in a way that maybe is just pushing the comfort zone of the teacher a little. I'm very comfortable in this now because it's a practice. I've been doing it for years and I teach others, but I didn't just like overnight get into this accommodation mindset and practice, right? And so we can start on the edge of our comfort zone with the equality thing. Like, I think just coming down to the student's level instead of hovering over them physically, managing the energy and mindset of like, I am the authority and therefore you must do X, and just like getting curious about this kid's having a hard time and maybe we could collaborate a little more. And then really seeing challenging behaviors like, you know, controlling behavior, avoidance, even some equalizing against other students of like touching them impulsively, like take a pause and really think about it as data of like, oh, okay, there's something else going on beneath the surface with this PDA kid's nervous system. How can I support them to get back to a place of safety? And there are more like easier concrete tools that I'm happy to talk about. I'm just sort of giving the broader framework so that professionals and parents can get creative because I'm not a teacher. So like how freedom and choice plays out in like a second grade teacher's classroom is sort of not my purview. And that's why I'm talking about like, this is the concept.
Right. I think also a lot of teachers are trained in trauma-informed classrooms, and using that even as a starting point can be really helpful.
Yeah. And thinking of challenging behavior defiance, opposition, like just exploring the idea that that might be a fight-flight response and that the child actually feels really unsafe in the body.
I have one last question for you as we kind of wrap up. If you were able to say something to yourself, send a message back in time as you were trying to figure out how to support your son, maybe before you even had a label for what was going on, what would you say? What do you think that earlier version of yourself maybe needed to hear?
Oof. I would say your intuition is right. He's not typical. I probably would have said your son is autistic and he needs a lot of support in his nervous system, and the root cause is the perception of autonomy and equality. And he also has some differences in social communication and sensory, but like when in doubt, work through the autonomy lens, and that will get you guys back to a place of stability. And it's going to be a long road, but it'll be okay. You're not alone. Yeah, absolutely. Casey Ehrlich of At Peace Parents, thank you so much for your time today. Sure, no problem.
As a clinician and a neurodiversity advocate, a parent and a neurodivergent person, I frequently feel like I have a bird's eye view of the various forces that are pulling, sometimes in different directions, for what they see as the right way to do things. I see the both and in situations and often talk about how there's nothing that's worth talking about without nuance. With that being said, I want to share one quick thought about accommodations and support for neurodivergent kids. It's really tricky to figure out the best way to support a child who's struggling. Obsessive-compulsive thoughts and anxiety have to be supported in one unique way. Kids with demand avoidance need to be supported differently. However, you can imagine how those two things might present in very similar ways. And this is only one example of the overlap in presenting concerns. While recognizing the barriers that many folks experience to accessing neurodiversity-affirming care, whether it's from a lack of providers to financial and insurance constraints, I want to encourage you to seek some outside support from someone who can help you tease out some of those differences. Co-regulation is always a good support, and we can't go wrong by helping kids self-advocate. By having someone who gets to know you and your child and can offer support and guidance to figure out the best path, that can be immensely helpful in the long run. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Our thanks to Casey Ehrlich for her point of view during Autism Acceptance Month. We have links to her work in the show notes. Also, if you need to find out more about the SPACE program or our courses or anything else we offer here, you can find it all there as well. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our social media and office manager is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us here, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.